right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Megan Altus. I'm the director of the St. Augustine Historical Society. When Dr. Graham and I spoke a few years back about his manuscript, the St. Augustine Historical Society was, of course, honored to work with him once again to publish this extremely important piece of the puzzle of American history. So we're really excited to be here with you this evening and to see this come to fruition. I'd also just quickly like to thank Flagler College. Flagler College Lifelong Learners and Flagler College for not only hosting the event, but providing the hors d'oeuvres and the wine. Eat more cheese and wine. But thank you all so much for working together with us. We've been partnering with Flagler for decades now. And I think especially in recent years with our new partnership with Lifelong Learners, we've been able to bring our St. Johns County community some really memorable evenings and educational evenings. And so we're excited to continue doing that and partnering with Flagler from here on out. And also I would like to just remind everybody that we'll be meeting back in this room again on January 9th for the annual meeting of the St. Augustine Historical Society with Mr. David Nolan, who will be our speaker in January. So we look forward to seeing you then. But without further ado, to make a proper introduction, I'd like to introduce Dr. Wayne Riggs.
Thanks, Megan. And more red wine is on the way. Seems to be a popular request. Tom didn't know I was going to introduce him tonight, so sorry, Tom, for the non-advanced warning on this. I'm Wayne Riggs. I'm the Dean for Graduate and Education Programs at Flagler College, but I started as a history professor in 2007. And so for me to be here tonight to introduce Tom is an incredible honor. I remember vividly, right, some of the interview experience that I had with him. Anything that I say to introduce Tom is not going to kind of capture Tom as a man or as a scholar. I think we all have our own interaction with Tom, a lot of it filled with dry wit. I think he's probably the king of dry wit in St. Augustine. My interaction has been the same. Tom ran our history program, was the foundation of our history program from 1973 to 2008, single-handedly for most of those years, right? So he is... He is a scholar of St. Augustine, but he is a scholar that built a remarkable program here at Flagler College. When I first met Tom, it was in 2007. This is what I remember, so I'm just going to do like maybe two stories here, right? Which is, I think it was a phone interview, and I'm calling in from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a snowstorm, right? It's probably January or something. It's snowing and it's cold. And Tom says, and I think it was during the phone interview, he says, "Well, so you grew up in Pennsylvania, you live in Milwaukee. That's a lot different than Florida. What can you say to convince us that you would be able to adapt to Florida?" And I said, I kind of read him at that point. I said, "It's minus 10 degrees here right now." And he said, "Okay." So the dry wit was there in the interview. And just as kind of probably an end to this story, right? I'd interviewed on campus, and I loved the thought of working at Flagler College. Who wouldn't want to be here as a historian? And I remember talking to my family, and I said, not only do I really need a job, right? I'm a grad student, I'm broke, but I really want this one. And I did. I wanted to be in St. Augustine. And it was on the drive back to the airport that I thought, I think I have a shot at this. Tom drove me back to the airport. I don't know if Tom remembers this. And this is back in the day before, like now our faculty who interview, like we give them a rental car and they drive themselves. At that point in time in 2007, the olden days, people picked us up from the airport and drove us back. And so Tom's driving me back and he says, "You want to stop, to get something to eat?" He didn't have to do that. We could have just made it to the airport. So we stopped at a Wendy's. I know it was a Wendy's. And we just had a burger and fries and a soda. And it was an inconsequential meal. But I knew at that point that not only did I need a job and I want to be here because it's beautiful, but I want to be here because of the people who are at Flagler College. This reminded me of my family who would have a meal on the way to something and make you feel welcome in an unpretentious way, not making you feel intimidated, but just really connecting on a personal level. That memory has stuck with me from that day to this. And I pretty sure it was a burger that I had, but it was something like that. And I knew then, I thought, I think I have a shot at this job because I know Tom's not going to waste his time with people he doesn't like, hopefully. Maybe he does. I have no idea. But at the time I entertained myself thinking, man, I think I have a shot at this. And it was because of that experience. And there was some dry wit sprinkled in like throughout the interview process that I won't share. I will let Tom share his own dry wit tonight. So I'm really honored to introduce our speaker tonight. Born in Miami in 1943, Dr. Thomas Graham's family tree reaches back through the Sanchez and Alvarez families to the early 1600s in St. Augustine. He received his master's and bachelor's and master's degree from Florida State in 1965 and 1967. He had a conversion experience after this and received his PhD in history from the University of Florida in 1973. Dr. Graham was a professor at Flagler College from, and Tom, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong, 1973 through 2008, a highly respected authority of the life of Henry Flagler. After his retirement in 2008, he was conferred the Professor Emeritus of History from the Flagler Board of Trustees. As we know, he did not retire. He did not retire. His research interest in 19th century United States history continued right after his retirement. He is the author of numerous books, such as Flagler's St. Augustine Hotels, The Awakening of St. Augustine, Mr. Flagler's St. Augustine, and most recently and tonight, Valiant Soldiers, St. Augustine's Men of Color in the Age of Civil War and Reconstruction. He is a past president and honorary life member of the St. Augustine Historical Society and has served on the board of directors of the Florida Historical Society, really cementing this relationship that Megan referred to between the college and the city. Tom really epitomizes that relationship. And so please join me in welcoming for this presentation tonight, Dr. Thomas Graham.
Thank you for that. And I'm glad I get to speak next. Good to see you all here. Good to be here. And lots of smiling faces. And I hope this is a good evening. This started in 2017 when we had the controversy over removal of the Confederate monument on the plaza. And I wanted to keep it. And my strategy was, well, don't tear down part of St. Augustine's history, add more. So let's erect a monument to the Union soldiers from St. Augustine. Well, that didn't work. The monument's gone. So I said, okay. But when I said, let's erect a monument to the Union soldiers from St. Augustine, I said, well, I better find out something. Because I think, like most people, I knew very little. I knew there'd been a few Union men from St. Augustine, but I started scurrying around. This is one great thing about being retired is you can kind of do whatever comes next, you know. So this kind of fell in my lap, and I said, okay, well, we'll chase this for a while. And turns out I found about 140 Black men from St. Augustine who served in the United States Army and Navy in the Civil War. And I thought, wow, that's a lot. And I learned a lot more than I expected to begin with. And so one thing led to another, and then it led to the book you've got in your hand. I need to give thanks to a variety of people, a number of people. Charles Tingley, who is a research historian at the St. Augustine Historical Society Library on Avila Street. Bob Nawrocki, the librarian. Robert Cowart, the new boy who showed up just in time to deal with the mess that was handed to him in the way of a manuscript. And then we had lots of other people who worked it over along the way. Jeanette Vigliotti was the editor. Dan Schaefer, I got to mention him, emeritus professor from the University of North Florida. He had his students doing Civil War research. And that shows up both online and in copies of records that he donated to the St. Augustine Historical Society. And to Megan, who you saw just a minute ago, who shepherded this project through to publication. Okay, well, let's see. I've got a PowerPoint here, and I've got notes, which I picked up from the parking lot of the former post office because I put them on the hood of my car. And okay. All right. Okay. 1860 census. You can see the population of St. Augustine was about the population of a good size high school these days. About 2/3 white, 1/3 black. There had been a larger percentage of free black people back in Susan Parker's time. But it became harder once we went from Spain to the United States. It became harder to free enslaved people, but we still had some free black people in town. The slavery in St. Augustine was urban slavery. Most slave owners owned only 1, 2, 3, 4 slaves. There were some larger plantations for sugarcane, oranges, interestingly, out in the countryside. And there you did have some plantations that would have 60 or 80 enslaved people. And that looks more like what we're used to thinking about. The big plantations were over in the Tallahassee region, where they were growing cotton. So here it was a more intimate form of slavery, and we can't go into this tonight. It was still slavery, and there were some nasty things about it, and yet it was given a human face by the fact that it was face-to-face interaction between white people and black people on a constant basis in town, and yet it was slavery. And it was slavery that caused the Civil War. The one and only issue at the time was slavery at the secession conventions. The old issues of the protective tariff and the national bank and national improvements, they were all gone. It was just slavery. That was the issue. And we Floridians were one of the first to secede. This was a homemade flag. It has 2 stars for South Carolina and Florida. Since the ladies who made it didn't realize that Mississippi had seceded, I think 1 or 2 days before Florida. So about the only time Mississippi is ahead of Florida. And St. Augustine was enthusiastically in favor of secession. There just were, even though we had northern tourists in the wintertime, St. Augustine was a firmly southern city. This is the flag of the St. Augustine Blues. our local militia company that were local white men enlisted. And I put in our 3 black Confederates, since I've got to mention that because it always comes up. We did have 3 black men who were in this original militia unit. I think really, how do I have his name up there? Tony Welters. It's Anthony Huertas becomes Tony Welters, Americanizing his name. And he was the only one who was enthusiastically a member and remained a member of the United Confederate Veterans after the war. So a black man who cast his lot with white society. The other 2, I think, were just there, recruited. And I think they were on the rolls primarily because the government would pay for them. And rather than the white soldiers in the unit having to hire their own. They were all musicians. They weren't fighting men. They were musicians there for the unit. Tad more on them later on. Now I hope I've got the right. Okay. Very early in the war, March 1862, St. Augustine fell to the Union. So for the last 3 years of the war, St. Augustine was occupied by the United States. So its episode in the Confederacy was very brief, just a little over a year. The interesting thing is that the end of slavery came early in St. Augustine. As soon as the Union Army arrived and the local government was disbanded, the enslaved people in town started acting as if they were free. Occasionally the Army, in these early months, occasionally the Army would say, no, you can't be free. You've got to go back to your owner because your owner is a loyal United States citizen. If he was a Confederate, then, okay, we're not going to do anything for you. But they had to, that was the national policy at the time. Enslaved people belonging to loyal Unionists were still slaves. But for the most part, the black people in town simply said, we're free now. And they didn't care about the niceties of policies or the law. Well, another town that was captured, whoa, is this the one I want? I guess it is, was Hilton Head, South Carolina. Port Royal Sound, Paris Island. You can see Beaufort up there. This is all the Port Royal Sound area. The U.S. Navy needed a coaling station. By this time, we're to coal-fired ships, even though most of them still had sails. But the steam engines were not very fuel efficient. The EPA did not like the. So you needed to have a coaling station pretty close by, and so Hilton Head was it. Plus, Hilton Head is halfway between Savannah and Charleston. And the Union was thinking, we're going to capture one or the other of those pretty quickly. So it was useful as a base. And as it turns out, that's going to be where our St. Augustine men end up. Good heavens, am I up there taking up space unnecessarily? Okay, if you look at your books, you will see that this is identified as James Montgomery in the book. And there is a gremlin in charge of this. You know, whenever you put anything in print, the gremlin sneaks in at the last minute, you know. At least that's what the printer told me. But anyway, this is David Hunter. He was a friend of Abraham Lincoln. He was an Illinois man. He'd been out in Kansas before the war, back when the Civil War actually started in Kansas, when the Free Soil and the pro-slavery men were fighting out there. And David Hunter accompanied Abe Lincoln to Washington, D.C. to protect him because there were threats against Lincoln's life when he was going. And to jump ahead of the story, General Hunter accompanied Lincoln's body back to Illinois at the end of the war. Out in Kansas, he said, let me raise a black army out here. I'll go all the way to the Gulf of Mexico with my black soldiers. And Lincoln said no. He did not want to lose Kentucky or Maryland, slave states that were still in the Union. So Lincoln said, no, none of that kind of stuff. But what he did do with Hunter was send him to Hilton Head, South Carolina, where his abolitionist ideas might be put into effect. And in fact, they were. That very quickly, even though there was no national policy at the time, Hunter started raising a black regiment of men from the Port Royal area, because basically the white owners had fled as soon as the United States forces arrived, and a lot of their enslaved people had been left behind. And so Hunter said, we'll recruit them into a black regiment. Now, when the word got out that Hunter was raising a black regiment, the newspapers asked President Lincoln, what about this? And Lincoln, I guess he wasn't a very bright guy. He said, I haven't heard anything about this black regiment. I don't know what you're talking about. Now, earlier in the war, General who run for president in 56, and his name I know very well, General Fremont had been fired out in Missouri for attempting to liberate the slaves. And but this time, Lincoln was, the latest book on Lincoln shows how Lincoln managed to compromise and weave his way through the complex situation at the time. So Lincoln just kind of ignored Hunter's black regiment. Black men, all white officers, of course. And white men liked that because they could advance in rank. If you'd agree to be an officer in a black regiment, instead of being a sergeant, you could be a lieutenant. And you could be a captain if you wanted to be a head of a company. Okay, now the interesting thing is, since they were illegal, they were never paid. And then after months, Hunter finally gave up and said, okay, I'm disbanding my regiment, except for one company. This is Charles Tobridge. He was a Brooklyn guy, I believe, New York guy. And he became the captain of a company, and he was sent to St. Simon's Island, where there was a colony of enslaved people who had fled to St. Simon's for safety out there. And so Trowbridge's company stayed out there to protect them. And then by now we were deep into the second year of the war. Interesting, right now, you notice, well, editorial opinion, close your eyes if you don't want to hear this. You notice how some people are getting tired of the Ukraine war? And that kind of fits in with the old saying, wars are all popular in the first year. But by the second year, the body counts were starting to rise. The Confederates had won battle after battle after battle, and the North was looking for a general who could win. They had already found one out in the West, but they didn't know it yet. U.S. grant. And so Congress changed their mind and said, okay, they kind of took a baby step and said, well, okay, black men can be recruited, but we're not sure exactly what for. But as soon as that door was open just a crack, the first South Carolina was organized. And so same men that had been in the Hunter Regiment are in the first South Carolina. Rufus Saxton, new general on the scene. Isaac Johnson, October of 62, the first St. Augustine man who shows up as a member of the first South Carolina. And General Saxton comes to St. Augustine in September of 62 and declares the enslaved people in St. Augustine free. So we get an Emancipation Proclamation in St. Augustine months before January 1st, when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is put into effect. Okay, and so the Saxton wants to take his first South Carolina regiment and says, let's put them into use. Let's find out whether these black men will fight. And so what they did was they started doing raids up the rivers along South Carolina and Georgia. The Darlington, you can see it's got a Confederate flag. It had been captured by the United States Navy. And so it went on a raid. Which river did he go up? Might have been the St. Mary's. But here you see what all these raids ended up was Confederates on shore shooting at black soldiers in ships along the way. I should add, one of the good things about this is in the wintertime, the armies up in Tennessee and Virginia went into winter encampments and not much was happening. So newspapers and news magazines focus on what's going on down south, where fighting is still happening. So these small black units got more publicity in the news than perhaps they deserved, because there wasn't much else going on other places. But I think also it was intriguing. Everybody wanted to know, will these black men fight? Here's another scene on the Dobie River. They were going up partly to free enslaved people, partly to mess up, destroy Confederate resources, and in this case, to liberate some lumber that was needed. And so they visited a lumber yard to impress that lumber. And then we get Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Higginson is interesting. He is a Massachusetts descendant of the Mayflower, literary guy, friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson, discoverer of a young lady poet, Emily Dickinson, saying, you know, she writes pretty good poems. We ought to pay attention to her. But also an abolitionist. And he goes to Kansas. And he's out there in Kansas. He writes back to his family, say, here I am in Kansas with a rifle on my shoulder and a pistol in my belt. And so he's fighting pro-slavery people before the war. He was one of the Secret Six, the men who backed John Brown, John Brown's raid on Harper Ferry. Others of the Secret Six either fled the country or pretended to be ill. Higginson said, "Here I am, come arrest me if you want me." But they didn't. He had also, when he was out in Kansas, he had met Hunter. And Hunter knew him, and Hunter said, "Okay, why don't you come down here?" So Higginson leaves his regiment in Massachusetts and comes to South Carolina. This is January 1st, 63. A flag is donated to the 1st South Carolina, and Higginson accepts it. New recruits being sworn in. Higginson kept a diary, and this was later turned into a book, Army Life in a Black Regiment, which is one of the classics of, well, not just Black soldiers, but Civil War soldiers, their experiences in the war. Higginson, like a lot of, you see, there weren't enough West Pointers to go around. So both North and South had to take politicians and businessmen and even a literary guy. Higginson kind of laughed about this. He says, well, he went to the library and checked out books on soldiering, the military. So he's reading about Hannibal and that kind of thing. But he also believed in discipline, military drill. And he said, let's get these guys to line up. Let's get them to march. Let's get them to follow orders. Once they have discipline, the fighting will come easily. And I think that worked pretty well. By December of 62, there were 10 St. Augustine men in the 1st South Carolina. And Higginson writes, I'll quote from him, "There is one company in particular, all Florida men, which I certainly think the finest looking company I ever saw, white or black. They range admirably in size, have remarkable erectness and ease of carriage, and really march splendidly. Not a visitor but notices them, yet they have been under drill only a fortnight and a part of 2 days. They have all been slaves." Unfortunately, he doesn't say, and a couple of them are St. Augustine men, but they might have been. And then on January 14, 1863, Seth Rogers, who was the surgeon of the 1st South Carolina, said he was writing from Beaufort, which you remember is upriver. By the way, it's a good place to tourist. Beaufort, a nice little town, kind of reminds you of St. Augustine. You can go down to Paris Island and visit the Marine Museum there and that sort of thing. Seth Rogers says, from writing from Beaufort, "Before breakfast this morning, I stood on the shore and listened to the John Brown hymn sung by 100 of our recruits as they came up the river on the steamer Boston from St. Augustine, Florida. Our Lieutenant Colonel Billings went down last week for them, and today we have received into our regiment all but 5, whom I rejected in consequence of old age and other disabilities." The interesting thing about the St. Augustine men is, as Higginson notes, they were Roman Catholics. And whoops. Oh, I guess I don't have the music, but I've got the music in the book. One more valiant soldier here. The name of the tune is Hail Mary. And Higginson said, well, I wonder if that'll cause any problems with these Florida Roman Catholics coming up and join the unit. And it apparently it didn't, because he just says it once and then drops it. But that's good. And if you can read music, you can sit down at your piano and plunk out what Hail Mary, one more valiant soldier sounds like. Okay, this is James Montgomery, who is identified as General Hunter in your book. He was a Kansas bushwhacker. He was a Kansas Jayhawk. Oh, do we have any Kansas Jayhawk fans here? that they actually won a football game last Saturday. An important football game. But Montgomery was a guy who read the Bible and killed slaveholders. He knew John Brown. He knew Higginson. They were all out there in Kansas, soft-spoken. He was more of a harem-scarum kind of a commander. Higginson said he's really more fit to command 100 men rather than 1,000. But he joins and establishes the 2nd South Carolina. So now we've got 2 South Carolina units. They had to scrounge to find black men, and he went all the way to Key West looking for black men to recruit into the 2nd South Carolina. Now, Key West has erected this statue in recent years called there he is, the Forgotten Soldier. I talked to the sculptor and I said, what is he doing, raising his hand like that? Is he taking an oath? No, he's simply saying, don't forget me. I'm down here in Key West. But and anyway, out of that, there were 19 men from St. Augustine that were recruited in Key West. And I think they probably went down there because the Union occupied Key West all through the war. And I think there was a lot of activity there and there were jobs there. And so you could find a job working as a carpenter, building things for the Union Army and Navy. Well, okay. So the 2nd South Carolina goes up the St. Mary's River, burned the town of St. Mary's, which caused some problems. The South needed salt. They had gotten their salt from northern salt mines, including places like Michigan. There was an enterprising young man from Ohio, Henry Flagler, who invested in salt mines because he figured there was going to be a big need for Union salt. And he was right about that. But the Southerners, their supply of salt had been cut off. So they were boiling seawater to make salt. And the Union guys would go up and destroy those salt works. They'd look for a plume of smoke on the horizon and say, okay, that's where the Confederates are boiling salt water. This is the John Adams, a double-ended ferry that could go one way or the other, which was good on these rivers. Get out in our creeks around here in the marshes in a canoe or kayak, and you learn pretty quickly you've got to go with the current because you ain't going against the current. And that's what would happen when the Union boats would, and they always left at night. They'd always go out in the dark, and they would bump into sandbars and the banks of the river and stuff. So the shallow draft boat like this that could go backwards and forwards was just the ticket. Well, okay. There was a joke among the Unionists about it's time for our annual invasion of Jacksonville, because the Union went in and out 3 times. And this was the 2nd time. And the 1st and 2nd South Carolina, 2 black regiments all by themselves, went 20 miles up the St. Johns River to Jacksonville. And that was kind of taking a chance. Are these guys going to be able to make it out there on their own? The usual thing, they were going to try to liberate enslaved people, but there were very few left. By this time, the white owners had removed most of their slaves from the area. But it was a chance to establish a base in Florida that might be expanded. But after just 2 weeks there, they were pulled out to Hunter's disappointment. They did have one good fight. And in fact, one of the Confederates, which didn't make it into the book, Oh, by the way, let me go back. Next project is the men from St. Augustine who joined the Confederate Army. So that's what I'm in right now. And that's proving to be a bigger enterprise than this one because there's more of them. You know, you can see the white men outnumber the black men 2-1 in St. Augustine. So anyway, so if your name is Andrew or Passetti or Manusi or Usina, I've got a card. I'll give you my card with my email on it because I need pictures. I need memoirs from St. Augustine families who had men in the Civil War. So anyway, so that's for the future. Now, where was I? Okay, they were pulled out primarily because the Union had decided they were going to take Charleston. They were going to make a concerted effort to capture Charleston. Camp Saxton is the new camp there just outside Beaufort, which is now on the, all of this is on the, it's on the campus of the Navy Hospital there, and they won't let you in, even if you say you've got a good reason. Here's the failure to pass Fort Sumter. There's Fort Sumter, and there's the Union Navy with its monitors. And the Navy was going to just bust right through, and then they could head straight up to Charleston. But the Fort Sumter got the better of them. They damaged the Union ironclads, and the Navy had to pull back. The 1st South Carolina was on picket duty north of Beaufort at this time. And Higginson writes his wife and says, "You won't believe who just showed up here. Harriet Tubman." And he had known her back in his days in Massachusetts as an abolitionist. And we know Harriet Tubman as being, all right, students, what goes with Harriet Tubman? Underground Railroad. All right, so you get a gold star. She freed more people in one raid up the Combahee River than she did in her whole career with the Underground Railroad up north. More than 700 enslaved people fled to the ships and were able to escape. So good for Harriet Tubman. Glad she shows up. Even though the Army doesn't give her credit. And I don't know, well, all right, I will say it. She's Black and she's a woman. So anyway. Now, this is one of the problems is you don't have photographers down south. There's no Southern Matthew Brady. And once you get past a few months into the war, you don't get pictures from the South. Now, this is, since it's a Union soldier, we do have a photograph, one of these formal portraits. I didn't find a single St. Augustine man in a Union uniform, but this gives you an idea of what they looked like. And by the way, the red trousers didn't last long. General Hunter had asked for them. He said he wanted his soldiers to be distinctive. And I said, well, what the heck? They're Black men. They're going to be distinctive enough. But the soldiers didn't like them. And they didn't like them for the same reason that we think the British soldiers wearing red coats was a bad idea. The enemy can see us a mile away. Here's another raid. The Governor Milton, you can see it started out as a Confederate ship, but was captured by the United States. And on this, did I say South Modesto River? Higginson was wounded. He was shot in the side. He may have been wearing a coat of iron mail that would protect him from a mini ball. But at any rate, that ultimately will knock him out of the war. Okay, this is a, oh, did I have? Well, anyway, this is another raid to liberate some enslaved people. And the magazine illustrators loved this because some of the bloodhounds that were used to track runaway slaves attacked the Union soldiers. And here the illustrator has put a whole herd of dogs, which makes a great story. And they did free some enslaved people. They tried to take back the skin of one of the dogs as a trophy, but it spoiled on the way north. We had another South Carolina man who'll have to stand in for a St. Augustine man. George Harris, St. Augustine man, was wounded in the battle with the Bloodhounds, but he recovered and went back to service. Handsome looking guy. All right, Quincy Gilmore, he had been around. Oh dear. Now we're back to, oh, all right. I think I've lost a page here, but that's okay. I can just make things up. He had been around. He had been in charge of the artillery that caused the Confederates to give up the fort at the entrance to the Savannah River, which is Fort Pulaski. And but he comes in and he is he's brought in to capture Charleston. Now here's, I'll have to use this nifty thing. Is it going to work? Oh, wait. That's not what I want. I want a light. I want a pointer. There we go. There's Charleston. And there's Fort Sumter. And there's the battery that is going to not be captured in the movie Glory from 1973, that Robert Gould Shaw, leading the 54th Massachusetts in the attack there, an attack that never should have been made. It's just poor intelligence on the part of the Union Army there. But in this case, they thought the Confederate fort had been pulverized by artillery, but it hadn't. The Confederates had just been hiding, and they came out, and so the 54th Massachusetts didn't stand a chance. But they were sort of the elite unit from the North. They were from Massachusetts, of course. And Frederick Douglass had two sons in that unit. And the 54th serves along with the 2nd South Carolina from this time on in the war. Okay, so that charge having failed, Gilmore says, all right, we're going to go to siege warfare. And that means digging zigzag trenches, getting closer and closer to the walls of the fort until you're point blank range, and then you can blast the fort. Here's a picture of the black diggers coming back as white soldiers marched forward. But one of the black soldiers said, well, where the saber failed, the shovel won. And eventually the Confederates realized they were going to have to give up Battery Wagner. And so they evacuated without a final fight. And General Gillmore cast medals for those people who showed gallantry. And if you can go out to the post office parking lot, you can find the name of the St. Augustine man who got the Gillmore medal. But we had there were about 200 men who got the medal, and one of them was a St. Augustine man. Well, okay. All right, another year rolls by. 1864 is here, and it's time for the Union's annual invasion of Jacksonville. And this is going to lead up to the Battle of Olustee, the biggest battle. Truman Seymour really disobeys orders and goes out, marching out there. He's headed for the Swanee River, and he bumps into a much larger Confederate army than he had anticipated, and handles his troops badly. And the Union Army is whipped. And the black troops are kind of the rear guard. While the white soldiers are getting away, you've got the black troops holding the Confederates back, but the Confederates aren't coming anyway. They were pretty beat up as well. Every February, there's a reenactment at Olustee. You can drive out I-10, not a long drive, and buy all kinds of Civil War memorabilia and see a reenactment of the battle. This is the Union Monument there. It's a little off to the side. You have to step over a fence to get into the graveyard to see that, but it has Colonel Montgomery's name is on there, because it was the 2nd South Carolina who were there at Olustee. Okay, and so we're back to trying to capture Charleston. And here we see, well, we already know where it is. James Island was a place where the Union forces attempted to get closer. And you can see Battery Right and Fort Lamar. And that's about as far as the Union troops got. Well, maybe a little bit north of that. But the Confederates were ready for them. They knew that would be a route that the Union would take, so they had already sighted their cannon and built their forts. So they didn't get very far. But really, the main effort was going to be over here anyway. From this point, they wanted to jump off to Fort Sumter. And they did. The Confederates, let's see, here's James Island, what I was talking about just a second ago. There's Charleston up there, and there's Fort Sumter over there, and there's James Island, and here's the Union camp, and the Confederates are all up there. Interesting here is that you had Black Regiment and White Regiment fighting side by side, and the magazine illustrators liked this, and that was another big issue. One was, will black men fight? But the other one was, will white men fight alongside black men? And a couple of times the answer had been yes. And on James Island, the answer was yes again. And in fact, one of the white officers said, if it hadn't been for the black troops, we'd all been killed or captured. Well, there's Fort Sumter, although I use a nice color picture in the book, which I like, even though it's a little bit off subject. There was a big race as to who's going to be to Fort Sumter first. And I don't know. but the second South Carolina people wanted to be first. And they may have been first to raise the United States flag. You can see Fort Sumter, this is Morris Island over here. The south side had all been battered down, but the north side, the Union couldn't bring artillery to bear there. So it's still intact. And the 21st U.S. colored troops, that's the 3rd South Carolina. Towards the end of the war, the units got redesignated. So the 1st and 2nd became the 33rd and 34th United States colored troops. And then the 3rd became the 21st, which makes no sense at all, but that's what they did. And we're getting towards the end here. After the war, you can read the last chapter. Some of these Black men participated in politics in St. Augustine. The interesting thing to me is that we think Reconstruction ended in 1877. So that's going to be the end of Black participation in politics and society. But actually in St. Augustine, there were more Black men elected to public office in the 1880s than had been in the 60s and 70s. So it continued on until the 1890s. And then there was a concerted effort, not just in Florida, but across the South to once and for all eliminate Black participation in government. And so Florida, as in every place else, Black participation, Black office holding, came to an end by 1900 and didn't resume again until second Reconstruction, 1950s, 60s, 70s. Now here's Tony Welters, my one Black St. Augustinian, but dadgummit, he's a Confederate. And he's holding the fife that he played as the musician for the St. Augustine Blues. And he became kind of a tourist attraction. You know, this came from a postcard, a souvenir postcard. You know, sort of when you visit St. Augustine, go to this place and this place, and also pay a call on Uncle Tony. You know? And this is a modern day tombstone in San Lorenzo Cemetery, placed by the Sons of Confederate Veterans in the 1990s. But there is an original Tony Welters headstone there too. So he's got 2 headstones. And then right nearby is John Welters. And John Welters is Tony Welters' son. And John had an older brother who was also in the Union Army. So we had one Confederate one Black man in the Confederate Army and 2 of his family in the Union Army. And that's kind of North versus South. And this gets back to the beginning. This is the monument that was proposed by the University of Florida, which would have been erected in the governor's garden behind governor's house. Susan says I'm not allowed to call it the plaza, but I still think of it as the west extension of the plaza. But when the William Wing Loring Monument was removed, then there was no need for a Union monument to counterbalance that. So that idea died. And so you got a book instead. By the way, you can go, you don't have to go to Siberia. you can go to Trout Creek and you can see the two Confederate monuments out there today. Okay, now, questions? Can we take questions? Comments? All right. Yes, Susan.
I don't have a question. I just want to make a comment that I think your book is certainly a big contribution to St. Augustine's history, but it's a big contribution to the national story. It goes to reach far beyond St. Augustine. And as I mentioned to you, what's really interesting is there's another new book that just came out called Half American, which is about World War II Black men fighting the same fight 80 odd years later to try to get to fight. And will they fight? And will they be able to fight? And will the whites fight alongside of them? And that was just reviewed by the New York Review of Books. So the two are great companion books to read at this time because we're still dealing with that, at least in the 1940s. So that your book is way beyond a contribution to local history.
Thank you, Susan. Well, so far, the New York Review of Books hasn't located it. But it's just out. It's just out. Sir, you had your hand up a minute ago.
6 colored tombstones that Sacred Egg. And I've been there many times, and I've always been struck by the fact that their names, company designations, and their regiments are there, but there's no dates of birth or death. It's almost like they got short shrift, and I don't really mean that in a bad way, just that's all that's there. And so I was fascinated to find 3 of those gentlemen in your book. And I'm wondering if there's more that I've missed.
Probably. Particularly because Tolomato Cemetery, we know there's Civil War soldiers in there, but their headstones have been lost. And Nombre de Dios is a little later on, but it still has the same problem that over the years, tombstones disappear, wooden headboards rot away and stuff like that. Yeah, there's Pablo Gray.
His is the most interesting story because he's buried in a Catholic mission. Mostly Catholics get buried in Catholic cemeteries, but he was married to Georgina in Bernardina at a Baptist church. And I'm wondering if there's a story about their religion and their.
Oh, I can't answer that right now. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, not for him. Sir, are you going to speak up for another landmark in our town?
Hammond family, and Earl Hammond. He's probably the one that you talk to him to get you some information on the family history, because he's very studious about his family. He's also the same descendant of the alderman that got shot by the sheriff. That's a little bit of later on.
Yeah, continue.
Yeah, but it's the Hammond family. It's his family. Yeah, great job, great job.
Okay, thank you coming from you. I appreciate that. Well, you got to sell a lot of these books out there.
There are 2 existing gravestones at Tolomato of U.S. Forestry.
Yes.
They're both in the 20s.
Yes,
They're all mentioned in the book.
right.
I haven't been to the chapter on Reconstruction yet. So what was Reconstruction like here at St. Augustine?
Better than some places. Not without violence.
But the army was always here. Your old St. Francis Barrack. There was always an army, at least a company, if not a regular. So you didn't have Ku Kluxism around here like you could have out in a remote rural area. But there was still conflict. And to me, it was an opportunity missed. Because for a few years there, we had black men sitting on the city commission. It was okay. We had black men holding federal offices, and that was okay. But now in the 1890s, well, it didn't get away. It's taken away.
Could you elaborate on Harriet Tubman's role in the raid up the river?
No. Because I don't know. I don't know. Just read around. And there are sources that will say Harriet Tubman planned the raid. She led the raid. She was standing on the vessel, calling for people to come in. And then you look at the government records, no mention of her at all. So the sources are mixed. She clearly was there, no question about that. She clearly was involved, no question about that. How involved? No. Somebody, you get.
One more. So it sounds a little off topic, but you mentioned it in the book. At the Lincolnville Museum, they have a presentation about John Hay, President Lincoln's very young secretary, who was in his mid-20s. He was from Springfield. He brought him with him. And at the museum, they say he used to own 5 acres of orange groves in St. Augustine. And I was thinking, how does a 25-year-old who's been in Springfield, Illinois, his whole life, ever even know about St. Augustine? And you say it here in the book. I'm wondering, do you know any more about that trip that Lincoln sent him here to do?
Yeah, he was sent down here because Lincoln was hoping, and there were other politicians up north, hoping that Florida could be reconstructed, brought back in the Union just in time to nominate some good Republican for president. So Chase had his men in Florida, and Lincoln had his man, and he probably got the land on a tax sale or something like that. All right, Susie, you're gonna set me straight.
Pardon? I believe, John Hay bought that Orange Grove property. It was a piece of property that was, it was confiscated from someone who was in the Confederate Army. So it's sold like a tax sale. And then that's what I don't know that he ever developed it.
Yeah, he wasn't here long.
Right.
Yeah, and property ownership were all messed up by them. If you were a Confederate, your land could be confiscated because you were a traitor. But oftentimes it didn't happen. The Confederates would get your property back, and I don't know exactly how. That's a whole other thing. I saw a hand up here somewhere.
There's a mention in the, of course, just got the book of the Grand Army of the Republic in St. Augustine, which was, my research shows it was identified as a Black Grand Army of the Republic coast. And did you find any of their records or where they met, or is there any trace of their existence?
Another emphatic no. Romantically no. I wish there were. The Grand Army of the Republic was for Union veterans. And it's just because, and we've got, Charles, where are you? What is it today? It's not the Grand Army of the Republic, it's Sons of Union Veterans. Sons of Union Veterans. Okay, and supposedly it was to be integrated. But in St. Augustine and there's other places that are white GAR and a black GAR. And I don't know of any records. Now that's something I'm still hoping on.
Kirby Smith's attendant, who didn't he was black, and didn't he go with Kirby Smith to the locations where he fought? Didn't he go on trips with Kirby Smith?
Yes. If only we knew more about the I say that because Charles has written the latest word on guards. But here's an example of how these are typical black Confederates. People talk, the idea of black Confederates is pretty much been demolished. The idea that there are large numbers of black men who voluntarily fought Confederacies, that's disappeared. But you did have black officers who carried, white officers who carried their black manservants with them to be their servants as they went through the war. And that was fairly common.
During the war, the black soldiers that were in the Union Army, if they started losing the war and were taken prisoner, were they treated a lot differently than white prisoners?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Most famously at Augustine, wounded black soldiers were just shot. But some black Union soldiers at Augustine were taken captive and carried away as POWs. So, yeah, big controversy because Jefferson Davis said black soldiers can be treated as runaway slaves. And that could mean death. And Lincoln said, okay, if you start shooting black captives, we're going to start shooting white captives. And neither side did, at least officially. But you know, there are the Fort Pillow massacre out on the Mississippi River. Over.
No, I think you have a question online.
Oh.
So I'm just gonna pull that up. What will it take to get a USCT monument here? That's Edward Slayton.
I want to say, bring up the Warren monument. No. We'll see. We'll see. There's a little part of my brain that says, well, I've already had one person who's enthusiastic. He said, we all build that monument. And we'll see. Stick around. Okay, are we over time? Somewhere to be accessible.
Yes.
Out there.
Yes, when everyone goes out, we're gonna put Dr. Graham at the table to the side, and anyone who wants the book signed, I was just selling some books as well. And thank you all very much.
You're welcome.